Hey everyone, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're taking a look at a date that has literally haunted our calendars for generations. We're talking, of course, about Friday the 13th. Now usually this day is just a great excuse to stay in, dim the lights, and binge watch your favorite horror movies. But as we're about to see, the real horror doesn't always happen on a Hollywood set. Sometimes the history books are far more terrifying than fiction.
So why do we actually fear Friday the 13th? I mean, is it all just superstition? Well, let's dive into this. While the whole idea of a cursed day might seem like just a fun pop culture myth involving hockey masks and black cats, the actual historical reality of what has occurred on this specific date has some deeply unsettling roots. Tragedies, disasters, and unspeakable acts have aligned on this day in ways that challenge even the most skeptical minds among us.
And, timing is everything. Our source material points out that recently we actually experienced the first October Friday the 13th since 2017. That rare calendar alignment, it definitely brings a heightened sense of spookiness, but it also gives us a really profound opportunity to pivot sharply away from the pop culture fun and look at the undeniable, honestly horrifying facts of what has actually happened when the 13th falls on a Friday.
Chapter 1. A hip-hop legend falls.
We're starting with an event that absolutely shook the music industry to its core, focusing on the tragic end of one of the most influential and successful rappers in American history, Tupac Shakur. The sequence of events starts on September 7, 1996 in Las Vegas. Tupac was in town celebrating his business partner's birthday. After hitting up the Bruce Seldon vs. Mike Tyson boxing match at the MGM Grand with Suge Knight, the night took a fatal turn. At about 11:15 p.m., while stopped at a red light, a white four-door Cadillac sedan pulled right up to the passenger side of their vehicle. Someone inside rapidly fired into the car, hitting Tupac 4 times, once in the arm, once in the thigh, and twice in the chest, with one bullet actually piercing his right lung. He fought for his life for nearly a week, but tragically, he succumbed to his injuries exactly 6 days later. The date? September 13th, which was a Friday. For decades, the case remained unresolved, just surrounded by endless speculation. But the timeline takes a huge leap forward to September 29, 2023, when 60-year-old Dwayne Keith Davis was officially charged. Now, while Davis isn't accused of actually pulling the trigger that night, he is accused of calling the hit, bringing a massive, long-awaited update to a Friday the 13th tragedy that's lingered for over 2 decades.
Chapter 2. Twin Disasters in the Sky. All right, we're transitioning now from a targeted pop culture tragedy to mass casualty events. A lot of people harbor a real fear of flying, right? And on Friday the 13th, that anxiety is definitely magnified. On the exact same day, Friday, October 13th, 1972, 2 horrific plane crashes occurred on opposite sides of the world. It is a chilling statistical anomaly. On one side, we have the infamous Andes Flight 571, which became an absolutely brutal test of human survival. On the other, Aeroflot Flight 217 in Russia, which resulted in a catastrophic 174 casualties. Let's look closer at how both of these unfolded on this cursed date.
72 days. Just think about that for a second. That is how long the survivors of the Andes flight were stranded. The plane, carrying 45 passengers and crew, including members of the Old Christians Club rugby team, crash-landed in the treacherous Andes Mountains. Several died on impact, and more succumbed to the freezing temperatures and severe injuries soon after. As rescue missions were completely called off after 10 days, the desperate survivors, hidden in the wreckage, were eventually forced into the unimaginable, cannibalizing deceased passengers just to stay alive.
But their story's ultimately one of sheer, unbelievable willpower. As late spring arrived and the weather improved just slightly, 2 survivors made a miraculous decision. Without any proper climbing gear whatsoever, they scaled a 4,700-meter mountain peak and hiked for 10 grueling days straight into Chile. They traveled a total of 38 miles through absolute extreme terrain to alert the authorities. Thanks to their incredible endurance, the 16 remaining survivors trapped in the mountains were finally rescued. But on that very same Friday the 13th, there was no miraculous rescue in Russia. Aeroflot Flight 217 was attempting to land in horrible weather conditions. It crashed just 3 miles away from the runway. The stark, horrible reality is that all 164 passengers and 10 flight crew members perished. While the exact cause remains officially undetermined, it's highly speculated that human error played a massive role here. It stands today as one of the worst aviation disasters in history.
Chapter 3. Catastrophe at Sea. Shifting from the skies down to the ocean, let's walk through the doomed trajectory of one of the most infamous modern maritime disasters. On Friday, January 13, 2012, the Costa Concordia was carrying over 4,200 people. Under the command of Captain Francesco Schettino, the ship actually deviated from its standard safe course near Giglio Island to perform a maritime salute, which is essentially blowing the horn closer to shore to show off for onlookers. When rock formations were suddenly spotted right in their path, Schettino ordered a course correction. But a language miscommunication with the Indonesian helmsman caused the boat to be steered in the complete opposite direction. It took 10 seconds to correct, but it was just too late. At 9:45 p.m., the stern collided violently with the reef.
The aftermath was just chaotic and deadly. The impact ripped a massive 174-foot tear into the ship's port side, causing it to list and partially sink onto an underwater ledge. Tragically, 33 people lost their lives in the disaster. Adding to the horror and the outright public outrage of the situation, Captain Schettino abandoned his ship prematurely. He left roughly 300 passengers behind on a sinking vessel to be rescued by helicopters and motorboats. He was later found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to 16 years in prison.
So, the really crucial point here is the staggering scale of the fallout, which is perfectly represented by this number: $2 billion. That was the estimated total cost of the cleanup, the victim compensation, refloating, towing, and scrapping the Costa Concordia. To put that into perspective for you, that is more than 3 times the ship's original construction cost of $612 million. It remains the biggest modern cruise ship catastrophe to date, forever linked to Friday the 13th.
Chapter 4. The Friday the 13th Murders.
We're shifting tone here to a deeply disturbing true crime segment. The details are solemn, they're graphic, and they really require us to look squarely at a very dark piece of history. Born into a military family, David McGreevy bounced around bases before enlisting in the Royal Navy himself. However, he was court-martialed and dismissed in August 1971 for starting a fire. After his life started crumbling, losing his fiancée, losing several jobs, his parents kicked him out. He was eventually taken in by his friend Clive Ralph and Clive's wife, Elsie. McGreevy became a lodger in their home, and he frequently babysat their 3 young children. He was actually regarded by neighbors as someone who loved kids, but then came Friday, April 13, 1973. What happened that night defies comprehension. It really does. McGreevy, who was known to be a violent drunk, consumed 7 pints of beer at a local pub before Clive picked them up to watch the children. Left alone while the parents worked, McGreevy became infuriated simply because the baby, Samantha, was crying for her bottle. In a highly intoxicated and enraged state, he brutally murdered all 3 children, later retrieving a pickaxe from the basement to further mutilate them. He was arrested wandering a nearby road at 3:50 a.m. Now, though he was sentenced to multiple life terms and spent 45 years in protected prison conditions due to his notoriety, the parole board actually cleared McGreevy for release in December 2018, declaring him no longer a risk.
Chapter 5. The Ultimate Irony. After hearing about plane crashes, sinkings, and brutal murders, you might be thinking, you know what? The safest bet is just to hide under the covers. Well, that is exactly what Daz Baxter tried to do. On Friday the 13th in 1976, Daz decided the outside world was simply too risky, so he chose to stay in bed all day long to actively avoid any bad luck. In a stroke of incredibly dark irony, Daz was killed anyway when the floor of his apartment block spontaneously collapsed right out from under his bed. It's a surreal story that perfectly juxtaposes the triviality of our superstitions with the utterly inescapable nature of random tragedy.
Which brings us to our final thought for this explainer. At the end of the day, is it really just another day? Our sources show us countless examples of misfortune and downright tragedy occurring on Friday the 13th. But objectively speaking, horrific events happen on literally every other date on the calendar as well. So, I'm going to leave you with this. Is the calendar itself actually cursed by some dark unseen force? Or is tragedy simply and tragically just an inevitable part of the human experience? Thanks for joining me as we explore the evidence, and I'll leave that for you to decide.